The farmer had always believed that hard work alone could tame the land. Each morning, before the first light touched the hills, he would rise, his hands rough and weathered, carrying the same tools his father once held. But over time, the fields began to change. The soil, once dark and rich, started to lose its strength. Crops that had once grown tall and full now wilted early, their leaves curling as if they were whispering their quiet surrender. Season after season, he planted the same crops, hoping that effort and persistence would bring back the harvests he remembered. Yet, with every year, the yields grew smaller. It was as though the land itself was turning its back on him, refusing to respond no matter how hard he pushed. His neighbors whispered that perhaps his land was cursed, but deep down he knew it was something else, something he could not quite understand. At night, when the lantern burned low and silence filled the small farmhouse, he would sit alone and wonder where he had gone wrong. He thought of his father and grandfather, men who had built their lives on the strength of these fields, and shame crept into his heart. How could he, with all his determination, be the one to let the land slip away? His family relied on him, and the weight of their hope pressed down heavier than the tools on his shoulders. His children watched quietly as their meals grew simpler, as laughter around the table turned into long silences. He avoided their eyes, not wanting them to see the doubt clouding his spirit. Even his wife, who stood by him with quiet strength, could not soften the ache in his chest when he walked past barren rows where corn once danced in the wind. One afternoon, as he knelt in the field, running his hands through the pale, tired soil, he felt a deep heaviness in his chest. The earth no longer felt alive. It was dry, exhausted, like a friend who had been asked for too much and had finally turned away. And in that moment, the farmer realized he was not just fighting the land, he was fighting himself. His own refusal to listen, his own blindness to the whispers of nature. He lowered his head, the silence of the fields pressing against his ears. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, caught in the emptiness of a land that once gave everything, but now seemed to hold nothing at all. One evening, as the farmer stood at the edge of his weary fields, an older neighbor walked by. The man was retired, his back bent with years, his steps slow but steady. He paused, looking at the struggling crops, and then at the farmer's tired face. Without judgment, he simply said that the land was speaking, but no one was listening. The words lingered like a puzzle, soft yet heavy, settling deep into the farmer's mind. The next day, the old neighbor returned, carrying a small sack of seeds and stories from his past. He spoke of years when his own fields had grown tired, when no effort could force them to yield. He explained that the earth is like any living being. It needs rest, nourishment, and kindness. Planting the same crop year after year, he said, is like asking a weary horse to keep pulling without water. Sooner or later, it collapses. The farmer listened, torn between doubt and curiosity. He had always believed that work and persistence alone could overcome anything, but now he wondered if his stubbornness had been the very thing draining his land. The old man showed him how to rotate crops, how to plant cover that fed the soil instead of taking from it, how to give back what had been taken. He explained that weeds were not always enemies, that worms were signs of hope, and that patience was the greatest tool a farmer could wield. At first, the farmer resisted. The changes seemed slow, almost too gentle compared to the relentless drive he had known all his life. There were no promises of quick harvests, only the quiet suggestion that, in time, the land would remember how to give again. Still, he found himself following the neighbor's guidance, if only because he had nothing left to lose. The first season of change was the hardest. The crops were thin, the yield barely enough to feed his family. Doubt clawed at him each night as he looked over the quiet fields, wondering if he was a fool to trust in something unseen. But amid the struggle, small signs began to appear. He noticed earthworms returning to the soil, tiny shoots of cover crops holding the ground together, and the faint stirrings of birds that had once vanished. These small changes were not the abundance he longed for, but they were like whispers of encouragement, fragile reminders that nature, though wounded, had not abandoned him. And for the first time in years, the farmer began to believe that maybe the old man was right, that respect, not force, was the key to unlocking the land's strength again. Years passed, and the farmer's land slowly began to change. What was once pale and lifeless grew darker, richer, alive, with the quiet hum of life beneath the surface. Earthworms wriggled through the soil, birds nested along the edges of the fields, and wildflowers returned where none had bloomed for years. The air itself seemed lighter, filled with the scent of new growth and the rustle of crops swaying together in the wind. The farmer, too, had changed. His shoulders no longer carried the same heaviness of despair, but instead bore the calm strength of patience. He had learned that the land could not be forced, only cared for. Each season became a conversation rather than a battle. Some years brought plenty, others little, but he no longer saw failure in the lean harvests. He saw them as reminders that nature has its own rhythm, and that to live in harmony with it was to find peace. His children, once worried as they watched their father's struggle, now grew up running through fields of corn that stood tall and proud. They laughed again at the dinner table, sharing bread made from their own wheat, vegetables fresh from their soil. His wife smiled more often, her quiet faith in him rewarded as their home flourished once again. One evening, the farmer stood at the edge of his fields, the setting sun painting the horizon in shades of gold. He thought back to the days when he had nearly given up, when the soil had felt like dust slipping through his hands. Now, as he looked over the thriving land, he realized the truth his neighbor had once shared. Respect nature, and it will respect you. The old man had long since passed, but his wisdom lived on in every leaf, every grain, every breath of wind that rustled through the farm. The farmer understood now that he had not just restored his land, he had restored himself. The soil's renewal mirrored his own heart, teaching him patience, humility, and the strength of trust. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the soft chorus of crickets rising from the fields. The earth, once silent, now sang again. It was not just the sound of harvest, but the sound of harmony, a reminder that when we give care, the world answers back with quiet generosity. And with that, the farmer smiled, knowing he had not simply saved his land, but had been saved by it in return.